Hey everybody out there, it's Timothy here. I'm doing something a little bit different today. For anybody who's watching this video, first off, the draft that's going on in the background is just not really related to the video. Since we're talking about Ixalan, I figured why not run it over some footage of a recent draft I did. This will not be a video I'm actually posting online, so, I'm not really commentating on the video. It's just something there. If you're a visual person, you like to watch things while you're listening. But anyway, the purpose of this video is I wanted to go ahead and talk about the next set that's coming out, Rivals of Ixalan. And I wanted to kind of make a couple statements, put a stamp on Triple Ixalan, because honestly, I've played for 5 years now, almost six, since Theros started up to this point, and Ixalan is the first draft format where I just didn't like it, where I felt there were problems, not just problems, but like obvious problems with the draft format. And I'm not bashing like developers. I still think there's a lot of fun to it. I think there's some cool things, but it is the first set where I realized, I'm not a huge fan of this set. There's things I don't like that I think could have been better. And my purpose in this video is to go ahead and point out the things that I think went wrong with Triple Ixalan and kind of muse a little bit about what Rivals of Ixalan can do to fix those problems. So, again, this is entirely my opinions. I'm not bashing the set. I'm not saying it's awful. I have ranted a little bit about it at my local game store and everything like that. So I've made my opinion clear about the set, but I wanted to just go ahead and say goodbye to Ixalan, basically, and see what we can look forward to. And at this time, there have not been a huge number of spoilers from Rivals of Ixalan. Spoiler season hasn't started yet, and we're still a little under a month away from the new set coming out. So there's a lot of expectation and a lot of wondering still going on. We don't exactly know how Rivals is going to pan out, but let's go ahead and get into it. Identifying a couple of the problems with Ixalan first, before I talk much about what I want out of Rivals of Ixalan, or at least what I think Rivals can do to fix this format. We got to identify the problems, right? So a lot of people ask me, I say I don't like Ixalan, I don't want to draft it. People at my local game store see that I'm just playing Commander instead of draft, which is unusual for me. And they ask me, what don't you like about Ixalan? Like, it's cool. And I have to admit, the flavor is awesome, right? That was the big selling point of the set, pirates and dinosaurs, right? And the vampires and merfolk is awesome. But what is it I don't like? It's mostly the draft structure. It's the way it works for draft. And everything I'm saying does relate to draft and draft only, because this is a good sealed format. It's awesome. Two-headed giant's really fun, but 1v1 draft, like your Swiss drafts, they're not great. The number one problem with this set, in my opinion, is that the draft format wasn't created to support multiple drafters in the same tribe. This is a very unique set in that you don't necessarily want to go into a color combination. Like, yes, blue-green's very good, but it's not just because the blue and green cards are good. It's because merfolk is good. You want to draft a tribal synergy deck. You want to be pirates. You want to see a black-red pirate deck or a black-blue pirate deck. You don't want to be green-blue with like a bunch of dinosaurs and a bunch of merfolk. You want to be green-blue merfolk, right? The problem is, it's not drafted in a way that supports multiple people being in the same tribe. So, for instance, let's say I am drafting merfolk. My first couple picks are some blue and green merfolk cards, and then it just gets cut. There are no more merfolk. It's very obvious that someone drafting a couple seats down to my right is also in merfolk, and they're just getting the first pick at all the good cards. Well, now my deck falls apart completely. In a normal draft set, if you're drafting blue-green and it gets cut, you can shift into another color pair that supports some of the cards you've already drafted. So you could go green-black or green-white instead, or you can take your blue cards and you could go blue-red, blue-white, something like that. You take what is working and you work around with it. That doesn't work in Ixalan. In Ixalan, if you get cut on your tribe, you're in a lot of trouble. Or if somebody a couple seats down from you is in the same tribe, you are in a lot of trouble. And it's really weird because Pirates and Dinosaurs has a little bit more leeway here because they are supported with 3 different colors, but it's really noticeable when you're drafting something like Vampires and Merfolk, which are some of the best decks when you get a really good one, but that's only because other people weren't drafting it when you get those good decks. If you start drafting Vampires and then somebody else is cutting you on Vampires, no matter where they are in the table, you're going to have a pretty lousy deck most of the time. And I'm not saying like 2 people at the same table can't draft Vampires, but there's a lot of extra nonsense in these sets, or in this set in particular, that don't support you and other people being in the same tribe. So there's not a lot of flexibility. There's not a lot of mobility when you get cut off. And since you want to be in a high synergy deck, it doesn't benefit you when you have to switch colors because you're basically abandoning all your picks. If you start off green, white dinosaurs and then you shift into vampires, what do you do with all those green dinosaur cards you had? They get a lot worse and your deck kind of falls apart a little bit at the seams. And you notice the decks that win are the really high synergy or really high aggro decks, which we'll talk about aggro here in a second. On the same point, this is a very weird format in that there are two color pairs that aren't even supported. And sometimes you end up in those color pairs and it feels bad because you don't know what you're supposed to be doing. So the two I'm talking about are the black-green decks and the blue-white deck. So you'll notice by this time that black-green and blue-white don't have any gold cards. They don't have any multicolor cards because they're not supported by multiple tribes. There's no tribe that cares about black and green cards. There's no tribe that cares about blue and white cards. And when you end up in those decks, they're pretty bad. They still have archetypes, so to say, but they're not really supported. I think black-green is supposed to be an explore-based deck. It's supposed to take advantage of Wild Growth Walker and Lurkin Chupacabra, Shadowed Caravel, Emperor's Vanguard, cards like this that explore, but it doesn't work. I mean, those cards are fine enough in some other decks that people usually take Wild Growth Walkers for their Dino decks and stuff like that, but when you end up in black-green, you're not going to have a good time. I'm not saying they can't win. They certainly can if you draft it right. You still take good removal. Sometimes you just curve out on your opponent, right? But they don't match up particularly well against high synergy decks like pirate decks and stuff like that. If your opponent has a very focused deck and all their cards work together, all their cards make each other stronger, then you're going to find it really hard to beat those decks with black-green and blue-white. And I don't even know what blue-white's supposed to do. I think it's supposed to just be like a tempo flyer deck. A lot of people have pointed out favorable winds as like the hallmark card for the deck, but I don't know. The very first draft I did of Ixalan, I 3-0'd with a blue-white deck, but it was basically just a bunch of Raptor Companions and Water Trap Weavers. It was just attacking. There wasn't a lot of reason, but not having two whole color pairs that don't lead to real decks is kind of problematic for the format. Moving on to the second major point outside of the color distribution and the actual draft is the fact that this is just like an unforgivingly aggressive format. It's hyper aggressive, and the last couple sets have been aggressive, where they've looked to the second set in each block to kind of fix that, which we'll talk about that with Hour and Amonkhet here in a second, but this is such an aggressive format. It's whether you're Merfolk, Pirates, Dinos, or Vampires, you want to be attacking no matter what deck. And I really dislike that every archetype in the format is just based on attacking and killing your opponent. There's not a lot of room for playing any build-arounds. There aren't even a lot of build-arounds to begin with, but basically, if you're not attacking and you're just blocking, you can fall behind, and it's so easy to just lose to an aggressive start due to how aggressive some of the cards in this set are. And I feel like if you're not drafting aggressive creatures, you're not doing right. And if you happen to miss your 2-drop slot, sometimes you just die. If you don't have a removal spell for your opponent's first play and then they suit it up with some sort of enchantment, you just die a good number of times. It's very unforgiving, which is the word I was trying to pronounce a second ago. And there are not a lot of early game answers too. So not only is it aggressive, which is fine, we've seen aggressive formats before, but there aren't answers for the aggressive cards. The one card that always comes to mind when I think about this format, and the one card I really don't want to play against, is Wanted Scoundrels, the 4/3 for 2 mana. When it dies, your opponent gets 2 treasure. It seems like such a huge downside to play a card like that, but it's a 4/3 for 2, and there are only 2 cards in this entire format that can deal with it by turn 2. Lightning Strike and Walk the Plank. 2 uncommons, mind you, are the only cards that can deal with that 4-power creature. So your opponent plays it, they usually get to just smash with it, and if they back it up with a removal spell, it's good game. You're done, right? It's really obnoxious, and that there aren't answers. Imagine what something like Magma Spray could have done for this format. And the parallel here is to the most recent block before Ixalan, which was Amonkhet and Hour of Devastation. So when a lot of people played Amonkhet, they complained that it was such a hyper aggressive format that sometimes if you lost your or if you missed your 1 or 2 drops, you could just die to some of the aggro decks. But this is a little bit different because in Amonkhet, or at least when triple Amonkhet was out, you could draft long game decks. There were, ramp decks with Sandworm Convergence at the top, like 8 mana cards in your deck, and there were just a lot of really cool things you could do with cartouches and trials, and you could go off in the late game. You could, draft all sorts of stuff. And I think as most people will remember triple Amonkhet as an aggressive block, but also keep in mind that the best deck in that format was like the blue-red spells deck with Enigma Drakes and Warfire Javelineers, a deck that basically didn't even play that many creatures, Cryptic Serpents, right? So even though it was an aggro format, you could do other things. You can't do that in Ixalan. You can't play anything that's basically not aggro. Or if you do, you got to have a little bit of luck on your side that your opponent just doesn't stomp you or have good rares in their deck or something like that. And the reason I keep bringing up Amonkhet is because look what Hour of Devastation did to Amonkhet. It turned Amonkhet on its head and became probably one of the best formats I've ever played. And I think a lot of people would agree that Hour of Devastation was a fantastic format. It supported aggro. It still gave us aggro cards, but they introduced a bunch of walls. They introduced more removal spells, more ways to actually deal with your opponent's aggressive starts if that's what they had. So just as much as I love Hour of Devastation, I think it is a good example of what Ixalan can do to kind of shake things up, or Rivals of Ixalan. It has the potential to fix things. And then just a couple other gripes I have. Cards like Charge and Monster Sword are just unnecessary at uncommon. When this set is already aggressive enough and your opponent is playing and curving into Charge and Monster Sword, it's such a feel-bad moment. That card should not be an uncommon in a set that's already geared towards aggro. If there were less aggressive decks in this format, I'd be happier with its presence as an uncommon, but it's like it almost feels like the glory bringer of this set, where you just roll your eyes when your opponent plays it on curve. And then Jade Guardian, the other card I wanted to specifically gripe about. Jade Guardian +1 with the wind. Everybody knows the combo. It's the cheese. It basically wins on its own if you are ahead of your opponent in any capacity, and there's no way to deal with it. There are no sweepers, or at least the sweepers are bad, and there aren't edict effects or ways to make your opponent sacrifice like an attacking creature or something like that. They just didn't give answers to this common hexproof creature, and it's part of the reason Merfolk is so good is because it just gets this super evasive common that you can jam in your deck and go off with, and it's really annoying that there's such a non-interactive way to win a good number of games, and it feels bad when your opponent plays it. And finally, last gripe before I get into the main point of this video, the Explore mechanic, I love it. I think it would be better suited for a less aggressive set, but there are times where, despite Explore being pretty fun and thought-provoking, it isn't what you need. If you are on the defensive, Explore can be backbreaking. Sometimes you play a 2-mana 1/2 and it explores, and you need it to be a 2/3 in order to block, but you draw a land instead. And yes, that means you played a 1/2 that draws a land for 3 mana, which is still a good card, but in the late game, you play cards like Sunrise Seeker or Queen's Commit, I don't know, the 6 mana Explore 4/4 lifelink or 3/3 lifelink. If you don't hit the counter, those cards are pretty bad, even if they draw you a land. The land becomes less relevant as the game goes on. You don't want to hit lands in the late game. You want the extra counter so your creature can keep up. But you don't have a lot of control over when Explore works and when it doesn't. And that leads me to thinking Explore could have been tuned a little bit, or maybe just isn't suited for the type of format we have here. But those are kind of my issues with Ixalan. And with all of those being said and put on the table, I want to kind of mention what are the things that Rivals of Ixalan can do to kind of shore up some of the weaknesses of triple Ixalan. I want Rivals to be great. I want to look back on Ixalan block and say, wow, that was a fun block to play, although I wouldn't recommend triple Ixalan. First things first, to support the problems I said with the actual draft, which I thought were the main problems with triple Ixalan, I feel like they could do away with some of these more meaningless creatures. I bet if I pause the video right now, I'd be able to pick out 2 or 3 creatures that don't have any sort of tribal synergy. And things that come to mind here include the entire keeper cycle. This whole cycle of mediocre to pretty poor commons that have 8 mana activated abilities. None of them have a relevant creature type. One of them's a Trilobite. That's not even like a real creature type. One of them's a hound. One of them's a bat. Like, imagine if those had been tribal cards. They probably would have had to been changed a little bit, but at least it wouldn't feel bad when you're playing them in your deck some amount of the time because you didn't make playables. Imagine a card like Blossom Dryad, which is just not very good in this format because of how aggressive it is. Imagine if it was a Merfolk. At least it'd have a little bit more synergy with the blue-green decks, and you wouldn't feel so bad about playing it, right? There's just so much BS in the set, for lack of a better term. Just these unplayable creatures that you don't want really in any deck, and they kind of end up filling your deck anyway because there's so many of them. There are numerous times I've drafted these green dino decks, and I just really want a good 2-drop, but my 2-drops are all Ixali's Diviners and Ixalan's Keepers and stuff like that. And I really want dinos, but there just aren't enough. And like I said, if there are multiple people drafting the same archetype, it becomes less and less likely that you get cards you actually need for your deck. So I think Rivals should do away with a lot of the goblins and a lot of the other just random humans and stuff like that, and focus on the tribes. If you're going to make a tribal set, there needs to be cards there, or there need to be cards there that people can use in their tribal decks. And I get that flavor is a big thing, right? You can't just have all 4 tribes and say, here's Ixalan, this is all that's on it, right? You got to add a couple things in there for flavor, but I don't feel like there have to be as much. I think the Keeper cycle kind of highlights that. That's just, 1 card out of every pack. Let's say you're drafting vampires. You just really, really need a good early game vampire. You're in white-black. White-black seems pretty open, but the only white-black cards coming around to you are the white and black keepers. They're not very good in the vampire decks, right? Or at least they're not what they could be if they were actually on theme and did something with the rest of your deck. And I think if Rivals increases the concentration of archetype-specific creatures, it would support multiple drafters. And I feel like another example that Ixalan did kind of right, but not fully, is there need to be good tribal payoffs that are still good in other decks that aren't focused on that tribe. So good examples of this are cards like Savage Stomp and Deathless Ancient. These are cards you can just play in any deck that you're playing the colors in, right? I would play Savage Stomp in most of my Merfolk deck, Deathless Ancient in my Pirate decks, right? But then you have cards like River Herald's Boons, or Bloodstained Bishop, the 5-mana 3/3 that drains or hits your opponent equal to the number of vampires. Those cards they fall flat outside of their intended archetypes. And if those are the cards that are wheeling around, they don't do anything for your deck. If I'm drafting black-red pirates, there's no way I'm playing Bishop or Bloodstained Bishop. It just doesn't do anything with my deck. So I feel like increase the number of cards that have really good tribal synergies that do something extra when you have a certain tribe, but decrease the number of cards that don't do anything when you don't have the tribe. Like River Herald's Boon is a great example. You're not playing that in anything that's not a dedicated Merfolk deck. It's just terrible outside of an actual Merfolk. Very easy fix is they could give an identity to blue, white, and black, green, or at least support them in a way that you want to draft them sometimes. And if those end up being the open color pairs, you don't get completely trashed for moving into those colors. So some gold cards in those colors would be nice. Encourage some slower gameplay. This is what Hour of Devastation did so right, is that it encouraged slow gameplay, but still left aggro decks alive. They gave good aggro cards in the set, and then they also had ways to interact with them. They introduced a bunch of good blockers. They had good build-arounds and payoffs. They had very good ramp creatures and reasons to play ramp. And then they also had the removal spells to back it up. Like I said towards the beginning of this video, imagine if Ixalan had Magma Spray or Shock or a 1-mana way to deal with smaller creatures early in the game. It would have been great. It would have been very necessary. When your opponent is playing an aggro deck and they're just crushing you with some super aggro creatures, and Fire Cannon Blast is the best you've got, sometimes you die. What if they have a combat trick? What if they can pump their creature in response? It doesn't work out well. I think if aggro is still going to be focused, if every archetype in the format is still going to be focused on just attacking and jamming and dealing 20 to your opponent, then Rivals of Ixalan is going to have to give us some answers to that. Some ways to deal with these early game creatures. And another thing, the last thing I'll actually mention here that I would really like to see from Rivals of Ixalan are some unconditional sweepers. Most sets have 1 or 2 sweepers. Ixalan has some very, very corner case conditional sweeping effects like Fiery Cannonade, or at least whatever the card that deals 2 to all non-pirates. It's not enough. Settle the Wreckage. Doesn't even hit everything you want it to most of the time. Granted, those cards are both good, but Ixalan could have benefited greatly by having some sort of uncommon infest type effect. -2/-2 to all creatures. And Fiery Cannonade's not enough. Imagine when you play against decks where Fiery Cannonade's not good, but just a way to be able to sweep the board. Even just a traditional 5-mana Wrath of some sort. They usually have those in most sets. It would have been fantastic. It would have helped this set a lot. And they could have been rare, uncommon, so that you don't face it all the time, but at least it would have given you outs in certain kind of decks. Hour of Devastation had tons of sweepers, like 7 or 8. I'm not saying you have to do that, but if Rivals of Ixalan as a small set could introduce 2 or 3 more sweepers into the format, I think it'd be pretty good for the set. So that's kind of my thoughts there. I would love to hear what you guys think. If you enjoyed Ixalan, if you can tell me some of the things you really enjoyed about it, then that's great, because there are positive things to say about it. But overall, I wasn't a huge fan, and I am looking forward, or at least I really hope, that Rivals of Ixalan changes my opinion about the block. So with that being said, I hope this has been, I don't know, some sort of use of your time. If you got to this point in the video, then maybe you're still listening. But at any rate, those are my opinions. Those are the things I want to see from Rivals of Ixalan to fix Ixalan Draft. And I hope I can look back on this format as a block and say, yeah, it was a really great format. But as always, my name is Timothy. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, however you're doing it. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, I'll see you guys next time.